The other day, my husband asked me if I could repair this little hole in his shorts, and it occurred to me that this would be a good topic for this week's video: how to use the running stitch in practical and decorative ways to mend our clothing. So patching does have a practical purpose, but it can also be purely decorative. And Sierra says, I'm decorative, but perhaps not so practical. So, let's get started. And here's the finished pocket of these shorts here. Because yes, my husband does wear shorts in the winter, in Canada, outdoors. I'm going to actually show you how to do this on a less fiddly little bit here. I have the sample that I started patching and haven't quite finished yet. And now that patch is kind of close to the edge of the hole, so I'm going to add another piece of cloth there to make it a little bit more secure. And for my first pro tip here, if you're working with more than one layer of cloth, you can bury your knot in between the two layers there, and then you will have a clean finish on both sides. So your piece could be reversible if you like. And you can do that at the beginning and at the end of your thread as well. So, to add this patch here, I'm doing a running stitch very similar to a basting stitch, but perhaps a little bit shorter, all the way from one side to the other, and I'm making a point of going over the outside edge of that piece of cloth so that the ends are secured down and don't get frayed, although it's not really a big deal if they get frayed. You might like the look of a frayed edge, and that's perfectly good too. And I'll just make my way back and forth over the length of the cloth, and that's exactly how I added the patches onto my bag here, just by adding one patch at a time and not worrying too much about whether things matched or not. I just grabbed a piece of cloth and a piece of thread and started sewing. And then once I finished sewing all the way down the length of the cloth in one direction, I'll turn my piece 90 degrees and I will sew up and down in the other direction as well. And all of these stitches are strengthening the cloth underneath. And then when I finished doing that, I noticed that the hole on the back was not stitched down. So I'm going to add some more stitches from the back side here to cover over the loose edges of the hole there. And I'm doing the same thing, just sewing running stitch all the way along one length and then back down the other length. And while this isn't an intentionally decorative stitch, I think it looks quite attractive once it's finished. But I will tell you, if the cloth has started to wear out in one spot, you'll likely start to notice holes and bare spots in other places as well. So you might end up adding more patches than you thought you would in the first place. So for my second pro tip here, your stitches don't always have to go in a straight line. In this case, I stitched around in a circle. And you can also use running stitch to do something called darning. Now, when I say darning, what I mean is I'm not adding a patch here. I'm just sewing in and out with a running stitch back and forth without adding any more cloth, because I don't really want a lump in my socks. In the space where the hole is, the stitches are woven together. I'm not actually pulling the cloth together over the hole. I'm adding stitches to fill in the hole. You can add as much stitching as you feel like you need to make that hole secure. And now let's look at some intentionally decorative stitching. So some friends of mine had this idea to use the pattern in cloth to guide their stitch lines, and then when you flip the piece over, you can see that it makes a pattern on the plain fabric. And here's a slightly more elaborative pattern, and it looks great on this side. And let's take a look at the back and see how those stitches look on the plain background when I flip it over. So I've got this little piece of spotted fabric here, and let's see what kind of patterns I can coax out of this piece of cloth. So I've started just as I have the other pieces, and I'm going to let those dots guide where I place my needle. And I'm going down in one row, and then I'm going to turn around and come back in the other direction, and let's see how that works. So I'm struggling a little bit here because I went all the way to the end before pulling my needle through, and I'm not sure that I really like that. Now let me think about how I'm going to go back in the other direction. So I'm putting my needle in at the first dot here, and I'm going to go back. And I noticed that following the dots there, it staggered my stitches slightly. And I like that. That's an interesting look. And let's see what happens when we go back in the other direction. So I'm finding that every time I get to the end of the row, I'm really having to think about where I'm going to place my needle for the next row. And I'm only doing that because I'm trying to actually create a pattern here. If I didn't care, I could just go back and forth and let whatever happens happen. So I'm finding this to be quite a mental workout for me to think about where I'm going to place my needle as I go up and down each row. And I think if I had a longer length of fabric, I could really get going and have to think about it less frequently. But as it is with this little short length here, I have to think about it quite often. And then I thought, let me try something else. So I thought I would try creating a diagonal pattern, working with these dots in a diagonal, and see how that works. And that's created a diagonal line in a different way. And there you can see why I don't like to have buttons and beads on my cloth. And if I do, they're the very last things that I add. It's because my threads get caught up in them all the time like that, and I don't like it. And I'm not really too worried about getting my stitches right on those dots. If it's close enough, it's close enough. So you can see that this is creating quite a different pattern. And I imagine that there are all kinds of patterns that could emerge depending on how you decide to place your stitches on just the simple pattern fabric with the little dots. My cloth looks very different than it did when it started. So for this week's contribution to my year-long project, I'm going to be working on the back of this piece where I conveniently have this fabric that has spots on it. And I'm going to use these spots to guide my stitches. And what I decided to do was to take teeny tiny little running stitches sort of in a curved line around each of those spots. Not all the way around, just sort of in a C shape. And it's a little bit fiddly taking these tiny little stitches here. I don't have a lot of room to play, but we'll see what kind of pattern this stitching sequence ends up with. To tell you the truth, I'm not really crazy about the way it turned out. It looks a bit insubstantial. So let's see if it gets better if I add a second row of stitches. I will often do this if something doesn't go exactly the way that I was hoping. And instead of ripping it out and starting over, I'll see what I can do to embellish it and see what happens. And to tell you the truth, I'm still not crazy about this, but I'm still not going to rip it out. I'm going to leave it there, and there will be other opportunities to change that. Not everything I do has to be the star of the show right away. And I'm going to leave this video here now, but my Ko-fi supporters will also get an extended version of this video where I'll show them how I can create even more patterns out of this piece of cloth. My Ko-fi subscribers get early access to my videos And they usually have some bonus content that I don't always share on the public YouTube channel. So I'd love to have you join us over there if you feel inclined. And if not, maybe you'd like to watch another video in this series that I have on using the running stitch. Thanks for watching, and I hope I've inspired you to make something beautiful. Bye for now.